Hi, this is Scott Lanser, the Director of Associates for Biblical Research. And we're so glad you've joined us today for Digging for Truth. And I'm with my co-host, Henry Smith. And Henry, this is part 2 of our conversation about abortion. And I mentioned in the previous episode about the reality that abortion doesn't seem to be a natural fit for the subject of archaeology.
Right.
But actually, in this episode,
Yes.
we're really going to see that, yes, indeed, there is actually a quite profound connection to archaeology, to history. And so we're going to get into some of those details today. There have been a number of things discovered archaeologically,
Yes.
things connected with history. And so, of course, probably the primary way we see that connection was in this rather gruesome practice of child sacrifice. And so let's discuss that as that's been revealed in the Old Testament.
Yeah, in the ancient world, we find literary evidence of the practice of abortion, and we find literary evidence, writing material about certain religious practices associated with killing a small baby or child to a presumed god. And in the Old Testament, we find explicit mention of this practice. And it kind of strikes us as odd in one way, but in another way, it's really the same spirit over many millennia occurring. And here we have in Psalm 106, I think this is like one of the most important passages. Psalm 106 is sort of an indictment against Israel. It sort of goes through this list of sins that Israel commits against God and against His law, and how unfaithful they had been. And it sort of gets to the bottom. It reaches yes. the sewer, if you want to say it that way, the very, very bottom. And it says this about the Israelites, that they served their idols, which became a snare to them, meaning the Canaanite idols in Canaan when they went into the land. They sacrificed their sons and their daughters to the demons. They poured out innocent blood, the blood of their sons and daughters, whom they sacrificed to the idols of Canaan, and the land was polluted with blood. Idols and demons are connected with one another.
Yes.
In this
Yes.
Old Testament passage. It's the bottom. They've reached a level of depravity that's as low as it can get.
Yeah, and so I think what's amazing about this is that Israel was called to love the Lord their God, but instead, and they were warned, don't do the things that the surrounding nations are doing.
Yeah, that's right.
And they they didn't just do some minor issue, if there is such a thing, but they did this really horrendous evil thing. And it's connected with demons, and I'm sure that's why it's so corrupt.
Yeah, well, and in fact, in the Old Testament, we see Satan mentioned in several places, especially in the book of Job, right? And he's, of course, the serpent. He appropriates the body of the snake in Genesis during the fall. But in the Old Testament, we only see the word demon mentioned a couple times, and it's associated with child sacrifice.
Yeah,
it's very fascinating. We see it, of course, expressed in its fullness in the New Testament. Jesus comes, and this is overthrowing the dominion of Satan, right? So we see demonic activity. But here we have it in the expression of the psalmist. The other part is, Scott, God forbids the Israelites to do this. He knows what's going on in Canaan, and this is part of the reason why God brings judgment upon the Canaanites through the agency of Israel, because of what they're doing. That he forbids them in the case of Leviticus 20 from sacrificing children to Molech, and we're going to return to Molech and the importance of this particular god in a little bit. But clearly, this is historical context. This is taking place, and God forbids them to do it, and yet they persist in doing it for many centuries. In fact.
Yes. And it's interesting. This passage. One of the heart of that passage in Leviticus is, any one of the people of Israel or of the strangers who sojourn in Israel, who give any of his children to Molech, shall surely be put to death. That is just a perfect example of how death was legitimately meted out to those who would sacrifice their children. It's interesting.
Yes.
God is holy, and therefore you see the two sides of the taking of life. But there's a holy just side.
Yes.
And then there's a side where the human depravity and selfishness and demonic corruption has set in.
Yeah, that's right, and it's a perfect distinction back to our first episode where we talked about what the pro-life position is. Here is an expression of it. I had never thought of this before until you're drawing it out of the passage.
Yeah.
The murder of this baby to a false god, and then God brings judgment upon those who participate in it.
Yes.
And the agency is human agency. So here we have an authorization of the taking of life for this terrible crime.
Very good. Now, Jeremiah 7:31 is another important passage.
Yeah, now Jeremiah is centuries after the Leviticus passage, and yet this practice is still persisting in the land. It says this, that the Israelites built high places called the Tophet, and we'll talk about that in our next segment, which is in the valley of the son of Hinnom, that's outside of Jerusalem, to burn their sons and daughters in the fire, which I did not command, nor did it even come into my mind. That's a way of God saying, of course God is aware of it, but it's a way of saying, this is such a horrible thing. This would not even come into my mind.
Yeah.
And this is expressing God's holiness.
Yes.
And here we have centuries long, the Israelites participating in this practice in the land. God's holy people, covenant people, Scott.
Yep, that's right. Well, Henry, any archaeological connections here with this practice?
Well, here at the end of our first segment, we'll make a quick connection, and then we'll build on it in segment 2. The Phoenicians practiced this practice, and the Phoenicians are Canaanite. In later periods, the Canaanites who survived the entrance into the land, they went out and they colonized the Western Mediterranean. And we have found evidence in the Phoenician Empire and called the Carthaginian Empire, which will show up on the map on the screen, of different places in archaeology where this evidence has been discovered. And we'll be showing that in our next segment. It's connected, even though it's in the Western Mediterranean, it is connected culturally to the biblical accounts and the land of Israel in that area.
Yeah, we really want to expand this discussion further now that we've laid this basic groundwork. Well, the topic of abortion and its connection to child sacrifice in the Old Testament is important, and we're going to continue this discussion, expand upon these things, look into the scriptures together and discuss these important points. And we are so glad you joined us today for Digging for Truth. We hope that you're going to be informed, encouraged today as we continue this fascinating discussion.
In a culture of intense Bible-denying skepticism, Associates for Biblical Research exists to strengthen followers of Jesus by affirming the authority of the Bible. Our archaeological fieldwork and original research form a strong foundation in upholding the reliability of the Scriptures. For students or anyone asking if they can really trust the Bible, please visit our website and partner with us by joining our prayer team or financially supporting this ministry. And thank you for standing with us.
Welcome back to Digging for Truth. Today's discussion is focusing on the subject of abortion and its relationship to archaeology. And at the end of the last segment, we introduced, we introduced the fact that archaeology does give us clear connections to the subject through the subject of child sacrifice. I'm here with Henry Smith. And Henry, so we introduced that.
Yes.
And now we want to expand because we want to give some very particular examples from the archaeological record connected with child sacrifice.
We're talking about, we're going to bring up another map on the screen, that the Phoenicians were basically Canaanite. And the Phoenicians is a word that's been given to them by scholars. The Canaanites that survived the invasion by the Israelites. They colonized the Mediterranean. They were actually very sophisticated maritime traders, and they moved out into the Western Mediterranean. And archaeologists have found these sites, evidence that child sacrifice took place there, and they call them Tophets. And they get that name from the biblical accounts that refer to child sacrifice in a Tophet, which is technically is called a place of burning or a roaster. Now it could be used for just a regular crematorium in the ancient world, but the scholars have identified these places where child sacrifice in particular took place, and we see them sprinkled there in the Western Mediterranean, at the boot of Italy, and then of course in North Africa. And that's where we're going to look at. We're going to look at in North Africa, in the modern country of Tunisia at Carthage. Excuse me, at Carthage. And this is where the most famous Tophet has been discovered. Now we refer to the Phoenicians who settled in Carthage as the Carthaginians.
Yes.
So the line is Canaanite, Phoenician, Carthaginian, but it's the same culture, same material culture.
Yes.
And we bring up on the screen here a picture of these, it looks like gravestones, Scott.
Yeah.
And this is called the Tophet at Carthage. And it's quite extraordinary discovery. Evidence of children that were burned to death in fires that had been sacrificed to the Phoenician gods.
Yes, yes, and the descriptions of how that was done are horrifying.
Horrifying,
I
yes,
won't,
they are.
we won't even talk about it today.
Yeah.
It's horrifying, and so these particular they look like gravestones, but they're really stones to do with the dedication of the child in the sacrificial process.
That's right.
Some have tried to play down these Tophets in modern.
Yes.
Modern scholars have tried to say, well, this isn't really what was going on there. They try to redefine it, but that's really just has no support.
Yeah, there's lots of reasons why that doesn't work. There are the minority of scholars have tried to, but even secular scholars that recognize what was taking place here. Let's take a look at our next, a close-up of one of these. You can call it a stela or a stone. You see that triangle figure with the round head and the arms out to the side. These are distinctive Canaanite type of imagery, and we find variations of it. They represent two gods: Tanit Ashtart, which is the bottom part, and Baal Hammam, which is the moon at the top. You can see the moon above the head. And these are both found in the archaeological record. They have sometimes upraised hands, sometimes to the side, sometimes up, sometimes one hand, variations of it. And what's so interesting about these two gods, Baal Hammam is a very particular god, but there's this reference in the book of Judges, chapter 10, verse 6. It says, the people of Israel again did what was evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baals, which is a sort of a generic term about all the different Baal gods, which would include Baal Hammam, and the Ashtaroth, Tanit Ashtaroth. So here, the biblical author is very familiar with the Canaanite pantheon of gods, which made its way all the way across the Mediterranean Sea to North Africa. It's fascinating.
Yes.
So even though it's over 1,000 miles away, it's closely connected to the biblical accounts.
It really is. Well, we're going to look at some more here, but I just want to note that, as we're having this conversation, I'm hoping our viewers are going to connect this with what's going on in our own culture.
Yes.
And how this demonic practice, it contaminates the people of God, it contaminates our entire culture. It is a demonic, evil thing that is drawing people's hearts away. It's no surprise that people are so passionate about it,
Yes.
good or evil.
That's right. Yeah. And in our third segment, Scott, we'll make those connections a little bit more concretely. The gods, these ancient gods, it seems odd to us that people would sacrifice to them, but now we sacrifice the child to the god of self.
Yeah.
And we're going to talk about that a little bit later.
Yeah.
Let's make a couple more connections. We'll go. We have this limestone stela that's coming up. This is from a later period of time. Again, you can see the hand figures there, and the moon. Same god persisting for centuries throughout the Carthaginian culture. And then on the next slide, this is really fascinating, Scott. This one goes all the way back to the time of Judges. This is from the city of Hatzor, which was conquered by Joshua, and then destroyed and conquered by Deborah and Barak in the book of Judges. And we can see the two upraised hands on the screen and the moon at the top. So here we have from Hatzor, from the 13th century BC, connected 1,000 years later all the way over to Carthage. Same spirit, same false gods, same practice, taking the life of these precious little children, being offered up to what the Apostle Paul said would be demons.
Yes, yes. So this evidence is quite clear, and it's profound. It's amazing. We have these stones with these carvings, and we
Yes.
know, and of course we found all the, well, we didn't talk about this, but the bones of these young children.
Yes,
Just-
very, very small children. You can see on the screen here these burial urns from the 7th century BC. Over 20,000 of them have been found at Carthage, and there's many more to be uncovered. That's only a subsection of how many are probably there. And you find the incinerated remains of small children. The age profile, it's clear these are not children that just died in infancy, which was a frequent thing in the ancient world, but that they had been sacrificed to the gods mentioned on the stone and given to these gods through sacrifice. Very gruesome, but it grips your heart, and it should change you. It's changed me.
Yes.
It should change us, the church, to see that this same spirit lives today.
That's right. That's right. Well, we're going to continue this discussion when we come back. The connection between abortion and child sacrifice, the spiritual underpinnings of all of that. We're going to continue this important conversation. We're glad you joined us today. Join us in just a moment, and we'll continue this discussion.
Bible in Spade is a non-technical quarterly publication published by the Associates for Biblical Research. Written from a scholarly and conservative viewpoint, Bible in Spade supports the inerrancy of the biblical record and is a must-read for both the serious Bible student and anyone asking if they can really trust the Bible. Archaeological evidence, properly interpreted, upholding the history of the Bible. Subscribe today at BibleArchaeology.org.
Welcome back to Digging for Truth. I'm here today in the studio with my co-host Henry Smith, and we have been having an important conversation. Sometimes we say this is an exciting conversation. This is not one of the exciting ones,
no.
but it is one of the most important ones we can have.
Yes.
And we've talked about the relationship between abortion and child sacrifice. We've been looking at some of the archaeological evidence that's showing that indeed that there really was child sacrifice going on. But this segment, I think, is one of the most important segments because we want to connect this now to the secular progressive worldview that is promoting abortion in our culture. Henry, let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, it is always important. We've talked about in this program evidence, and in the ministry of ABR, evidence and how it interconnects with a worldview. And in the same way that the Israelites allowed their worldview to be poisoned by Canaanite religion, so the church often allows its theology to be poisoned by secularism.
That's right.
And when you start to mix non-Christian worldviews with your Christianity, eventually it'll take over your Christianity and subsume it. And this is why we need to be vigilant about what our understanding our worldview. I thought it would be appropriate to express. I found this online from this gentleman named Douglas Wilson, and it just so succinctly puts the distinction between Christianity and secularism when it relates to the issue of abortion. He says this: Christians and secularists both have a blood-red sacrament at the center of their understanding of the world. We have the broken body of Christ, the meaning of which is my life for yours. That Christ comes into the world to sacrifice himself for us. But the secular worldview has tens of millions of children who've been dismembered and killed, whose bodies have a very different word spoken over them. Your life for mine, meaning we take your life so that I can live my life the way that I want to, that I can be free from the responsibility and from all of what comes along with being a parent. Because we are followers of Jesus Christ, one is a faith of self-sacrifice, even if it costs our lives. So it's the antithesis of the secular culture of death. The other is a religion of self-indulgence, even if it costs you yours, meaning the child. Yeah. And I thought, what a sober, heart-wrenching, but truthful juxtaposition of these two worldviews when it comes to the unborn child. Yeah. So powerful.
Yes, and I find in a lot of the political discussions that people talk about, being loving and being sensitive and being compassionate, and yet because we don't have the biblical background to our understanding of what that means, we sometimes get even the idea of compassion and all those things twisted up and confused all the time. Yes. This subject is supposed to be seen clearly, crystal clearly by God's people.
Yeah, and there's a place for compassion. Yeah. And in our third segment of this series, we're going to interview Emma Johansson, who's going to come and share with us her ministry, Choice One, and what they do to have compassion to help young women who have an unplanned pregnancy. That's the proper application. But in the case, we have to lay the foundation first, and it has to be a proper compassion. And here's a question, Scott. I'm going to be kind of straightforward with this. What about compassion for that baby?
Yeah.
Where is that in the discussion?
Right.
And I know that's a rhetorical question, but that's how we ought to, as a church, have to think. Yes, of course, a young woman caught in the circumstance of an unplanned pregnancy. What do I do? I don't have any money. All of those fears and questions that they have. But we have to have compassion for the child too. That's and right. As a society, as the church, we have to figure out how to do both.
That's right.
The answer is not killing the baby. That's not the answer to the problem.
Yeah, when we end up at that conclusion, we have a strange distortion going on. Yeah. Why must we have the death of babies? It just comes across as a strange, twisted, demonic sacrament.
It's morally incoherent when you really think about it.
Yeah.
So
yes. Yeah. It's so much deeper than just discussing these details and the information. There's a spiritual side. Well, Henry, why don't you continue?
Yeah. So we as the church, we have to recognize this, and we have to recognize how to find ways to help women in these circumstances, how to appeal to their conscience, how to give provision for them if they don't have any money, all the things that need to be done. But we got to tell the truth about what this is before we can do that properly.
Yes.
And I wanted to continue on here from this Douglas Wilson article because it's just so well written. He says this, he says there will be no liberation from this crime. And he's talking about us living in a Western society. Even though we're Christians, we're members of the church, we're part of God's kingdom, we live in this world, in this culture. There would be no liberation from this crime unless there's a willingness to name the sin for what it is, and always will be. Abortion is human sacrifice. Yeah. And it's exactly what we've been connecting it to with child sacrifice. It's your life for mine, instead of the gospel, his life for mine.
Yeah.
What a difference.
Yeah, it's tremendous. I think that's such a fundamental truth we have to keep looking at.
And I would say, Scott, as we wrap up, we don't want the audience to misunderstand as men, first of all, we're not the ones that carry the baby, the woman does. But as men, we must fight for these children and fight for these women to help them in the culture through the church and through public policy. And that there's forgiveness in the gospel of Jesus. That's one of the most important things. If a person is out there watching and they've had abortion or participate in this, Jesus' death and resurrection is sufficient to forgive this sin.
That's right. This discussion is really all about love. It's about grace, because all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God.
Amen.
Jesus offers forgiveness for all. This is not about condemnation of anyone.
Absolutely not.
This is helping us all to see the subject more clearly. We want to agree with God that life is precious and important. Well, thank you for joining us today on this second part of our discussion about abortion and the issues of life. Thanks for joining us. We pray that the Lord will bless you as you continue thinking about these important subjects.